We're glad to be back in the conference room. And thanks again to those of you out in Zoom land who are joining us. This series, as you know, is part of the UC Center's commitment to bring you the very best ideas, insights, and evidence from the really world-renowned faculty researchers at the University of California. And all of it is in the hopes of delivering and supporting better, more evidence-informed public policy. So that's why we do it. The principle's really simple. California has a lot of problems. The University of California has a lot of researchers who are avidly working to solve those problems. And our center's commitment is to try to bring those two pieces together. So our policy themes this year are rebuilding the public health infrastructure, addressing the homeless crisis, and confronting drought and extreme heat. Today, we look specifically at drought, uncertainty, and the future of water for California. And we do that with the help of Professor Jay Lund. Dr. Lund is Distinguished Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Director of the Center for Watershed Sciences at UC Davis. He has a really interesting CV because it's ripe with both academic honors, such as selection to the National Academy of Engineering, and has also been actively engaged in policy, testifying multiple times before the Assembly and the Senate, serving on advisory committees for the California Water Plan, and working as lead developer on a large-scale optimization model for California's water supply system. The author of 5 books and some 200 journal articles, Professor Lund obtained his BA in Regional Planning and International Relations from the University of Delaware, and a master's in geography and a doctorate in civil engineering from the University of Washington. There are a few other interesting things in his CV, so if you'll indulge me. He played a leadership role with his college and alumni sailing teams, and he notes that in addition to English and passable French, along with a little Swedish and Russian, he has occasional outbursts of Pig Latin. Just a word about format. This, of course, is a hybrid format. For our question session, if you're in person, please just raise your hand and we'll direct a microphone to you. If you're on Zoom, type your question into the Q&A section on the chat and we'll take your questions more or less in the order received. So without further ado, Professor Prey, AJ Unlay.
Can you press that? Have you got it?
Oh, okay. We'll just do it up on your side. So sorry, excuse us. Got it. Okay. Oops.
Stop the share and
Yeah,
share.
I think it's stop the share and share.
Is there an engineer in the house?
Yeah. Okay.
That's good.
Share.
Yeah. Oh.
No matter how much you prepare, there's always something that goes wrong. And so you should just be prepared for things to go wrong. This is a lesson for engineering as well as politics, as well as anything having to do, especially with people.
Okay. So.
Okay, so let's see if this works.
Now.
Not sure.
All right, we're getting close, I promise.
Oh, that's working.
Oh, okay, it was,
It was.
okay.
It did. Now it's not. Now you can have an outline. So I'm going to talk about, well, we're going to talk a little about California water overall, a little bit about climate change and drought and other changes that we're going through in the system. A little bit about portfolio management. Portfolio management gives you a lot more options for how you manage things than traditionally. And then I'll focus a little bit on each of 4 big problems that the state faces in terms of water. And the rest of it you'll hear about later. Okay, so.
Is that it? Okay.
Drought, uncertainty, and the future of California water, all in 40 minutes. So this is going to be a little fast. And I will inevitably miss a few things. First of all, this is how we understand water. This is how most people understand water. This is how most elected officials understand water. Anybody. It rains someplace, we open our taps and water comes out. That's what we understand. Even people who are experts on water in California or anyplace else do not understand everything in that box. There are lots of, there might be thousands of people involved between the reservoir operations and the hydrologic forecasting and the different processes within the water treatment plants and the operation of the dams and the rivers and the operation of the pipe networks and the maintenance of the pipe networks and the water quality monitoring throughout the system before you open that tap. All of those individuals are very smart. They know a lot about their bit. And some of the managers know even how all the bits are connected without knowing the details of the bits. So we operate in a system in water, as we do in medicine and probably every other field, where we know water comes out of the heavens someplace, and we see it when we open our taps. In between, it's kind of a partial mystery to us, even to the most experts. So just so you don't feel too ignorant. Everybody else has some ignorance in this as well, even the experts. I want to give you a little bit of an overview today of California water, some look at climate and droughts. How do we manage these very complex systems, particularly for the future? I want to focus on 4 big problems. And then how do we prepare for the future? Thoughts on preparing for the future, some conclusions, and then because I'm a university professor, I will give you some further readings. This is a map of California's water system, and you can see it's pretty intimidatingly complex. So water and people in California. The first fundamentals of California water are that it's in the wrong place at the wrong time compared to where we want it for humans. So most of the map on the left is a map of runoff. Where does the runoff come from for California? The dark blue area is 20% of the surface area of California that produces 2/3 of all the runoff. The light blue, that's the next 20% of the surface area, produces another 24% of the runoff. Right there, you can see that 40% of the surface area produces 90% of the runoff. Where is that? It's up north. When is that? Is it in the summertime? No, it's in the winter. So we have a very skewed availability of water. It's in the north, in the mountains, in the wintertime. The dark red area is 30% of the surface area of the state, produces 0.1% of the runoff. Where do the people live? Down here, a bit around here, a little bit around here. Where are the crops grown? Down here, down here, a little bit up here, a little bit, substantial amount up here, a bit along here. The people and the crops, our biggest water demands, are where the water ain't. And when do we want that water? In the summertime, in the spring. Irrigate the crops, irrigate our lawns. Half of our urban water use is landscape irrigation. So the water is where and when the demands ain't. Okay. And so this is wonderful for civil engineers because we get to build all of these aqueducts, reservoirs, try to reoperate that water so it provides water at the times and places where people want it. And then we've come to discover in the last few decades that, oh, we want to keep the environment, some of the environment around too. So now we're having to reconcile those things as well. Just for scale, this is the map of Israel to scale and of my home state of Delaware. So this is a really big system. People talk about Israel's water system, how wonderful it is. Well, this is the Negev desert. They don't really manage the water down there. Their water system, their national water system is, like Kern County. So just for perspective, they do some interesting things, some useful things for us to think about, but their problems are very different than ours. Oh, one more thing on this map. I want you to notice how colorful it is. Lots of different colors. On this map, they represent different ownership. We have a big federal projects. We have big state water projects. We have lots and lots of important local water projects where the local districts, either as wholesalers or as retailers, own their own reservoirs. They own their own aqueducts. Southern California has its own aqueducts to the Colorado River. Los Angeles has its own to the east side of the Sierras. So this is a very colorful, institutionally colorful environment, as you can read about in the newspapers with different people fighting about it. Droughts. California is also a wonderful place to study water, to work on water problems, because we have lots of them for the reasons I showed before, but also between years. So this is you can't read it very well here, but this is the annual coefficient of variation, annual rainfall variability from precipitation stations all across the US. As I said, I'm from Delaware over here, very boring. You move west, it gets more interesting. So this is a coefficient of variation. Those of you who have not taken statistics, take a statistics class. So it's, I'll invite you to start speaking. Is this hearing me? Is anybody on the?
Yeah, everyone can hear you.
Okay.
Everything's fine. I don't know.
Everything's
Yeah, everything's fine.
Everything is fine, so you've heard it. You go first. Except for there's a box in the middle of the slide, but it's okay. What do you notice about California? This annual coefficient of variation, which is a ratio of the standard deviation to the average, is much higher in California, even especially in Southern California, than it is anywhere in the country. What this means is that California has more flood years and drought years per average year than any other part of the country. More floods and droughts than average. Boy, that makes it interesting around here too. I can see Andrew Schwartz smiling even under his mask. California has lots of droughts. You can see historically, we have a lot of droughts. A longer period, going back 1,000 years or so, you can see periods of wetter and drier years. So you can see we've had some droughts in the Paleo period that are hundreds of years long.
I'm gonna go ahead and try to move that box out of your way.
And we're going to try to move the box.
Yeah, we're good. I'm gonna stop sharing.
There's something about having an engineer speaker that makes all things malfunction. This is Murphy's Law. This is another lesson about how the world works. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong, and at the worst possible moment.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay,
Okay, but we don't, yep, okay.
okay, we're
I
good?
think
Okay.
we're better now.
This tells us we have lots of droughts.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have lots of droughts, as you know from recent experience. And this is so in California water, we have a special New Year party on October 1st. New Year's Eve party at the end of September, because our water year begins October 1st. That's the beginning of the nominally wet season. You'll see here that currently we're at 0. So we don't have a very wet season so far. Last year at this time, we had one of the wettest Octobers on record. Welcome to California. You can see here the driest years, how we have a wet season here where this accumulation of precipitation climbs up and up and up, sometimes to amazing heights. But then we have a summer here that's very dry. I came here from the East Coast. This is a very weird climate. I'm still not used to it. This year, as I said, it's completely dry. The previous water year, 2021, we had this huge October, a couple of storms, and then we had, remember, that long period into April of no storms at all. And then we had a sizable storm, and then it was gone. And then here's that September storm that you might remember. This is a Mediterranean climate. We have a lot of variability. And wet years and dry years. You can see the averages right out here. We've been having a lot of dry years lately. But also the wettest year on record. This wet year, 2017, that's when maybe you remember Oroville spillway, the demise of Oroville spillway. That year was so wet that they had to shrink the map on this graphic, which is produced every day, in order to fit it on. So. Climate. Climate's changing. This climate is definitely warming. You can see it in the records. We can see it in hydrology. We have over the last few decades, we've had about a 1% shift of the annual runoff from the spring to the winter, reflecting snowpack isn't as big, more of the precipitation falls as rain and snow, 1% per decade. So that's the extrapolation. Less snow and runoff, more variability, more floods, more droughts. The higher temperatures also increases the evapotranspiration off the watershed, so less of the precipitation actually makes it down to the bottom where we're interested in the reservoirs and for the fish and things like that. So less runoff, but more floods for the same precipitation. So in essence, it's making California's hydrology more like California's hydrology. It's a more extreme value. It hasn't fundamentally changed the hydrology. It's just made it more extreme than the extreme that it already was. We have other changes that are really important in California. If you look at the history of California, it's a very dynamic place. The demography is always changing, the economic structure is always changing, the technology is always changing, the climate's always changing. We can add more things to this now. Economic structure affects water demand. So within agriculture, we're moving from a lot of annual crops to more permanent crops. That changes water demand. During a drought, it's more expensive to fallow fields than it used to be. We still have a lot of annual crops that we can fallow, fortunately, but we're going to have to be careful about protecting the more economically valuable crops for the well-being of the rural economies. Social objectives also affect our water demands. Certainly these days, one of our most important water demands is for the environment. Way back when the system was built, certainly when it was conceived of, the environment was something that is just, you were trying to manage the environment for people. Now we're trying to manage this human-dominated environment that also has some ecosystems. And we're going to have some big challenges with climate change than that because we now have higher temperatures. And different species are going to be better suited to those higher temperatures. And how do we manage all of this complex system when the fundamental climate is now better for different species than what we started off with? We also have invasive species coming in. If you go and scoop up a bunch of fish in the middle of the delta, in the southern part of the delta, you will find that something like 80 or 90% of the biomass, fish biomass that you scoop up with a big net, say, is non-native species. The delta is one of the top 10 bass fisheries in the whole country. Bass are not native to the delta. Wildfires. These higher temperatures, aridification of the landscape is also making wildfires more of a problem. In the previous drought, the 2012 to 2016 drought, we had over 100 million trees die in the watersheds. Shortly after that, many of you will recall, we had some major wildfires. The total economic damage of the drought, during the drought, to hydropower, agriculture, cities, everybody, was on the order of $9 billion over 5 years. Cumulative, 5 years, $9 billion. That's a lot of money, certainly to you and I. California has, at that time, a $2.3 trillion per year economy. So on a statewide scale, it's not so much. It's certainly a lot to that farmer, that rural community that got shorted. But on a statewide scale, we're wealthy enough we should be able to work with this problem. The wildfires after the drought, which were made worse by the drought that had ended nominally, several of those each caused $20 billion worth of damage and had dozens to hundreds of people die, something the drought didn't do directly. I've always thought it's amazing that we can have these huge droughts in California and not have any famine or pestilence. I mean, it's very different than what it would have been 300 years ago. We're doing, some things we're doing wrong and some things we're doing okay. In the history of all of this management of these complex systems, floods and droughts are really pivotal for how we rebalance and think about changes in management to the system. So all the major water, almost all the major water legislation comes in the aftermath of floods and droughts. We need a flood or a drought to help us as a society, as a polity, think about these problems. It's not unusual. They help us rebalance the activities that the local governments, the regional governments, the state and federal actions, and the private sector take in managing the drought. So we need that. Sometimes you need a crisis to make progress. There's a lot of other drivers, a lot of other changes that are occurring in California that are important for water. I'm not going to go through them all. There are some good changes. This is a share of employment for different economic sectors in California. So we started off as a mining economy, became an agricultural economy. Now agriculture is 3 or 4% of the state's economy, 3 or 4% of the state's employment. Service, we're mostly a service economy now. We still have some manufacturing, but it's different manufacturing than it was back in the early days. What does this do with droughts? Imagine how difficult these droughts we've had recently, and we still have today, would be if 30% of state employment were in agriculture. 30% of the GDP was from agriculture instead of 4%. It would be a much worse drought. So this change in the structure of California's economy has made our droughts much more manageable. There are reasons to set our hair on fire about drought, and there are some good things. Portfolio management. People often talk about water in California as it's just a matter of storage and conveyance. And some of those early maps sort of lead you to think that way. but it isn't. You've seen the variability we have with water in California. We also have to manage demands. There will be times when there's no way we could economically afford to build storage and conveyance enough to supply all the water that anyone would want. It's a little bit like traffic jams. Some of you have been in traffic jams. California, occasionally you have a traffic jam. How much would it cost to build road capacity so large you were never in a traffic jam? You wouldn't want to live in that world. You wouldn't want to have to pay for that world. Same thing is true with water supply in California. There are going to be times when we have shortages, and that's part of the portfolio that you manage. We have most of the people that have been very successful in managing water in California have a very diverse and integrated network of activities. They manage the supplies, they manage the storage, they manage conveyance, they manage groundwater and surface water. They have contracts, maybe water marketing agreements with other people to buy and sell water. They sell water when it's valuable and they have a little bit more than they really need. They buy water at other times. They reuse, all kinds of things. So I wouldn't say our portfolios are all of the above answers to California's water, but they're much of the above. There's still things like fog collection that I think are still a little beyond where any place in California would need to, would find it attractive to use. Portfolio management is successful, but it takes time to organize. It takes a little broader intellectual thinking about how am I going to combine lots of different things and make them work together. It's sort of like a financial portfolio or a transportation portfolio, bicycles, or walking, or cars, or buses. Portfolio systems give you quite a few advantages. So what do I mean by a portfolio? So here's a portfolio for a water supply system. You've got lots of different sources, streams, groundwater, wastewater, precipitation directly. You've got things you do to protect the quality of the water and the sources. You have conveyance, moving water from one place to the other, storage, moving water in time. Different ways we can treat water so that it's suitable for whatever different uses we have in mind. Operations in terms of how do we coordinate the operation of all these different facilities all over the place. Electrical grids are a really good example of that. We have lots of different sources of electricity, a big portfolio of electricity sources, conveyance. We can't store it very well, but we're trying to. And then on the demand side, you've got to make the supplies match the demands well. So what kind of use efficiencies and reductions can we make in agriculture, urban ecosystems, and recreation, all these different areas of demand? We have a whole bunch of different things, from bricks and toilets to low-flow shower heads to xeriscaping our lawns that we can use to manage our demands. Some of these demand management things are things we do permanently. Okay, I'm going to take out my lawn and put in some kind of xeriscaping. Or maybe I only do them during a drought. Okay, I'm going to just let my lawn die during the drought, and maybe in other years I might still have at least some lawn left. You'll notice that these supply activities and the demand activities especially require hundreds, if not thousands or millions of people to coordinate their decisions. Certainly on the demand side, I've got millions of households all over the state that are all using water. How do I get them to coordinate their decisions with the supply decisions that other people are working on? So we have to have, in this very diverse statewide system, incentives that encourage people to work well together. Just like we have rules of the road in traffic, or pricing in electricity. So we have things like pricing, markets, contracts, agreements, shaming. You ever seen any shaming? You know, you get your bill in certain water or electricity. here's how much water or electricity you used, here's how much your neighbors used. Okay? Shaming, it's remarkably effective. It's probably the most effective thing in motivating faculty. Subsidies, education, letting people understand a little bit more about the system. You will never get people to understand everything about their water system. I had a slide on that early on. But if they know a little bit more, sometimes it does help their behavior a bit. Sometimes insurance, you have to use insurance to give people incentives. These portfolios occur locally, they occur statewide, and how we integrate these mix of actions locally and statewide is really an important portfolio planning thing. We have way too many studies that only look at reservoir operations, or only look at groundwater, whereas the system does not function that way. The system functions as different supplies mixed with different demands, all decisions made by lots of different people. And most of their decisions are driven by economics. And so I'm a big advocate of using economics in your modeling to help see what the motivations are for people to work well together. And this kind of analysis and this kind of a portfolio approach, I think, is really the foundation for adaptation to climate change in the future. Because we don't really know what the future is going to be. Some nice things. We rarely die from droughts. So here's a history of deaths globally from different kinds of natural disasters. So you can see some big deaths from floods and droughts in previous decades, and now we have earthquakes. And they're usually not earthquakes in California, unfortunately. We have earthquakes, but we don't have the deaths because we have made preparations for these kinds of things. We also have, so this is global death rates. And you can see, because of general more success in managing floods and droughts, and particularly, I think, the globalization of food markets and improvements in global transportation, people don't die of famine and pestilence because of droughts, unless you have a war going on, and that's really the cause of the deaths is the war. A test. So academics, you always expect to see a test. So here's a drought test grades for different sectors in California. Urban sector has done very well so far. And you can find places they need to improve it. They certainly don't have a perfect score, but they've really had almost no damage, economic damage, personal damage, public health damage from these droughts. But I think they also need to be aware, and I think most of them are, that the next droughts are going to be harder because of this climate change and other things going on. Agriculture is a little bit more vulnerable. They use 80% of human water use in the state. Urban water use is only about 20% of human water use in the state. Most of agriculture has done very well. We've seen several years recently where they've had about a 30% loss of their normal water supplies and seen about a 3% reduction in their profits. So 3%, that's a lot, but it's not like 30%. So again, at the farm scale and at the statewide scale, regional scale, we've been doing fairly well. We should do better, but this is not performing so badly we need to flush out the whole system. Environment. Oh, here's one where we do terrible. We're mostly unprepared for droughts. The agencies are not well resourced. They don't coordinate with each other. It's like they studied for a different test. They have important things that they've done, but really we're suffering. I think partly because they don't have enough resources, partly because they're not so well organized and given the right authorities to go ahead. Rural water, I would have said for the previous drought, they had a D. We're moving up. There's definitely some improvements in rural water supplies. Rural water supplies are often having a problem from drought because the agriculture around them, they've made up for a lot of their loss of surface water by pumping more groundwater. And that lowers the wells, lowers the groundwater table, and you strands a lot of rural wells. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is the next thing, is another area where grades are improving, but the tests are going to get harder and harder because we're going to have to curtail. We're basically going to have to fallow somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million acres of irrigated agriculture, mostly in the San Joaquin Valley. So there's a lot of suffering that happened down there just because of mass balance. The Delta, we're sort of muddling through on the Delta, I think, in a lot of ways. I'd say the grades are improving a little bit. People are building a little better levees. There's some science that is helping us understand some of the ecological problems a little bit better, but I don't think we're really organized to actually solve these problems yet. It's the same is true for rural water supply. And then the governments, because government always gets the problems that we're unsuccessful at managing otherwise, they always have a hard time. And they're going to have to work more closely together because, again, the next tests are going to be harder. So let me go to 4 of these problems pretty quickly. Most of our native ecosystems are declining. We've had massive disruptions from historical land and water development changes and new invasive species, including us. Prospects worsen greatly with changing climate. We've had some successes in terms of major reductions in pollution. Probably still need some more. And we've also had substantial success at preventing some of the worst proposals for new land development and new water development. But we've had a lot of failures. A lot of our failures today, I think, are just continued legacy of bad things that were started previously. They're now authorized. So we're having to figure out, change really how we think about the environment. Not only how do we stop bad things from happening, but how do we decide what is a good thing to happen and how do we foster good things happening. That's a little different way of mentally approaching these problems, and we haven't made that transition yet. We have some fundamental difficulties, I think, in that we're not going to be able to restore to pristine conditions or anything like pristine conditions most of this system. And then we have to do this, whatever reconciliation we're going to do between the environment and our human-based water systems, we're going to have to do this reconciliation with a changing climate, to a climate for which the native species are not naturally evolved. This is hard to think about. And as a society, we haven't really started doing that thinking yet. And we have to do it within a political realm, right? And basically, our ecosystem management has lacked a business model and an agreed upon objective to allow it to be successful. If you look at the history of public health, you can see in the history of public health, we had problems when we weren't well organized, didn't have a business model to be effective. And then once we got organized and had a business model, it's not perfect. We still don't live as long and as well as we would like, but it's a lot better than it was in 1907 or so. Rural drinking water problems, about 1 to 2% of the state's population is affected. For reasons that I talked about before, a lot of vulnerability to drought drawdown, but also tremendous nitrate contamination across the state, and as well as a few other contaminants. And again, our problems, I think, are not so much technological as they are finance and organization. You can throw money at it, but if you're not organized about how you throw money at these small idiosyncratic problems that are scattered all over the state, it's hard for that money to be spent well and effectively. Groundwater problems, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is a great leap forward. Shows a lot of promise, but it has a long way to go. Like I said, we need to fallow between 0.5 and 2 million acres of land, mostly in the San Joaquin Valley. How do we retire that land responsibly? Especially because lots of different folks will have different ideas of what responsibly means here. In some ways, this is very similar to the problem we're facing on the Colorado River, where the system is very highly over-allocated. And again, in this Colorado Basin, we're going to have to retire a similar amount of water, similar amount of land, a similar amount of water use. Problems with the Delta. Let me count the waves. We have a lot of physical instability. The land is subsiding in much of the Delta. The sea level is rising. We've all had advanced Fluid mechanics? Okay, you kind of know how the story ends. The Dutch had the same problem, but they built Amsterdam there. So they have an awful lot of money to help them keep the water to that side of the levee, which they call dikes. We don't do that here. We can't do, okay, let's move San Francisco. Maybe if you have enough sea level rise, we'll want to move it to the Delta. I don't think so. Floods and earthquakes. So physically, it's not a very stable system. Ecologically, it's certainly not a stable system in terms of the habitat alterations we've had there and the invasive species. And economically, it's not stable. Again, sea level is rising, the land level is falling. What does that do to levee maintenance? The cost of levee maintenance. You have to have, there's a water gradient there. You need to have a countervailing economic gradient so that you're willing to make the expenses to keep the water out. And but we don't have that. So the long-term trends, you're fighting the gradient. Two gradients. Government agencies. Most important government controversial problems become the government's responsibility. The government doesn't get to pick its problems. They get thrust upon them, as some of you are aware. So, and then we blame the government when the outcome is not what we individually want. So the deck is already stacked against government to be successful because it's a hard problem. It's even stacked more against the private sector to be successful, which is why the government got it. So you always have complaints about government even though we need it. In my impression, local funding and accountability is really fundamental. Most of the water management decisions, maybe 90% of the water management decisions in the state are made by local governments. 80% of the funding of water management in the state is made by local governments with ratepayer funds. This is really fundamental. State and federal regulations are important to bring the broader social and environmental goods into consideration. Not there to provide money for normal operation and maintenance. That would bankrupt you. Success requires government regulations without micromanaging. So there's a difficult trade-off here. Good regulation has some discussion, a lot of good science, technical basis, and a motivating fear of micromanaging. This is where the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is brilliant. If you all, your local agencies, don't figure out and come up with a credible plan and implement a credible plan for reducing groundwater overdraft, the state's going to come in and take over your basin. And we're going to give you some money to help you out. Floods, last problem. We do pretty well with floods today. We had the wettest year on record, 2017. I don't think there was more than one death. That's remarkable. Floods are going to worsen with climate change. Our flood areas we worry a lot about the cities, and we should, but we have a lot of problems with rural towns and rural area development that don't have a lot of economies of scale and density of people to fund preparation for drought, for floods. And so community water flood insurance might be useful. Kathy Schaefer is one of my PhD students working on this. Preparing for uncertainties. We know how to prepare for certain changes. If we know something is going to change, we know how to prepare for it. We can see it, we know what it is. It's our fault if we don't do it. Preparing for uncertain changes. So we have probabilistic analyses, negotiations. We think this might be a problem, and we have some probabilities on it. We should be able to work our way through that. It's analytically more difficult, but we have portfolios and reserve funds that allow us to prepare for contingencies. We should be able to do that. Preparing for surprises. Nobody expected Oroville spillway to die in the middle of flood. Somebody should have been. Some ways they were. There are ways you prepare for us to be surprised. You keep reserve funds. You have some scientific capabilities. You have some governmental capabilities that you hold in reserve. You have people preparing for contingencies. There's a great quote by Eisenhower, came out of World War II, that the plan is nothing, but planning is everything. The idea that the way of thinking that you develop when you do good planning helps prepare you for the surprises that are going to be coming. It helps you get some contingency. So surprises need not catch us unprepared. I think that's really the lesson I want to get across. There are things you can do to prepare for surprises. I think the pandemic is a good example. In the water sector, it was as disruptive as it was in any sector, but none of our taps went dry. They were sort of prepared for this. We have a rich institutional ecosystem for managing water. Each of these kinds of institutions has different advantages and disadvantages in managing the current problems and the evolving and future problems and surprises that we're going to see. We should think about how to make these different sectors work well together, as well as how to make each sector work better individually. But it's going to take the sort of diverse capabilities, this portfolio of institutions, to help us get through some of these. And if we manage those relationships between the institutions better, it'll be better for the management as a whole. This is my favorite slide. It hasn't changed much in the last 10 years. Resistance is futile. We're going to see changes in this system. We're going to see flooding in parts of the Delta. We're going to see reduced Delta diversions, less irrigated land in the southern Central Valley. That's between 500,000 and 1 million acre and 2 million acre feet. We're going to see less urban water use. We're seeing it already. More reuse and stormwater capture, although I don't think they'll be huge. Some native species are going to be unsustainable in the wild. Again, partly because the temperatures are rising and making the environment unsuitable for them, regardless of what we would like to do. Funding solutions will be mostly local and regional. The state's leverage is mostly regulatory, not funding, although funding always helps. Nitrate groundwater contamination is inevitable for millions of acres in California. Groundwater will be more tightly managed, and the salt and sink will largely be restored. As a roof in Southern California. We're not going to be able to drought-proof this system, but we can manage it better. And they're my further readings. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Dr. Lund, for that amazing talk. And so I'm going to go ahead and let Brett stop the recording. Probably in a few